This video was prompted by a comment on one of my videos by Edward Taylor, who asked, how do you go about deciding what mechanics to use? Because if you watch my solo role-playing videos, you may get the impression that they are decided completely at random, which isn't quite the case. It's been a process of experimentation and evolution. And the first mechanic that I want to talk about, which I have found really useful, is using cards. Now, in my one of my Gothic horror games, I used a deck of Mythos cards, which I got from eBay. Now, you've got all sorts of cards here, and you can sort them into decks of locations, artifacts, events, spells, and you also have enemies and allies, which are really useful. I mean, if you sort them into decks and then you draw one from each deck, you've basically got an adventure ready to go, and it can be really useful because you've not got a games master to direct your story and prepare it for you. And it's nice when you don't know what's coming, so you just draw a few cards when you've sorted them into separate decks, and it will give you the bare bones of an adventure, which can be really good. Similarly, I have a deck of the Middle-earth collectible card game, and these again can be sorted into decks. You've got some gorgeous artwork on all sorts of locations, and we've got some events here, some kind of artifact, all sorts of if you sort them into decks, as I say, or into types, and you draw one of each type, it can suggest an adventure to you, and then you can use some of them to spice events up along the way. And there's all these sort of plots here which can get your imagination going. And even just the artwork is really evocative and inspiring. Absolutely brilliant. Now, this game here, I've mentioned it before, Quest: A Time of Heroes. Now, if you look at Tom Vassel's review of this, you won't think it's very good, but actually, I think it's a decent little game. It's, I've mentioned before, it's a choose your own adventure sort of game, mixed with a light role-playing game. And only this was translated from German, really. You have these characters here and things like that, but oops, excuse me, went out of focus for a minute. You have these cards here. The artwork on them is not fabulous, but they can be useful. They can suggest things to you. But the best thing about this game, you get 2 10-sided dice, which is always nice. You can never have too many dice, as you know. And you get lots of scenery. You get coins, you get standees, useful stuff like that. But by far the best thing are the location cards. Now, I've used these before because the artwork on these is gorgeous. And if you need any suggestions about where your fantasy adventure or even your Gothic horror adventure might go, then there are so many ideas here and really nice artwork. Very sorry I keep getting out of focus, gosh. But you get the idea that using cards from different games can be so inspiring in creating adventures. And the other game I'm going to talk about in this section is Mistfall. Now, I feel bad that I've moaned about Mistfall in the past. It's a difficult game for me because I love it and it drives me crazy. So it's like Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, you know, they love and hate each other at the same time. The location tiles from Mistfall are fantastic. They just look so gorgeous. I really love the artwork on these, they're amazing. And they can really inspire you to just, you know, give you ideas for adventures. I think the Dark Forest is my favourite. That looks so cool. There's all sorts of brilliant looking locations on these. And also Heart of the Mists again has a full set of these to inspire you. But anything like this from a game of any sort, be it a collectible card game or a board game or a role-playing game, any elements of that can be put together to create an adventure for you, and also to create changes along the way, you know, a sudden event out of the blue, or a strange item that you come across, or some treasure that you find, or a useful artifact. Those can be so useful, such a really evocative and inspiring mechanic to use. Now, another mechanism I've used a lot in generating plots and things are Rory's story cubes, which I found really useful. I've got a few sets of them. The ones I've found most useful are probably the Voyages, which worked really well in the Gothic horror adventures I did. And the original set, oops, I'm going out of focus. The original set are really good as well. And I've used the actions dice as well to look into characters' motives sometimes. If you come across an NPC and you want to know what they're thinking, then these have proved really useful. Not everybody likes to use these, but I found them quite handy. I've not really used the Fantasia ones too much yet, but they're kind of interesting. You've got sort of fantastical creatures and situations, which, you know, might be fun for a sort of high fantasy kind of game, or a game just about fairy tales, which you can make somehow a bit more grim. But yeah, they're not bad. In fact, I'm sure there's something like that in the actions ones. Very similar anyway. But one set I've not found too handy are the Doctor Who set. I mean, obviously I'm a Doctor Who fan, but these I've not found very useful. They're just a bit bonkers. I'm really sorry I keep going out of focus, but yeah, they're okay. They're just a bit too specific, I think, maybe. Silence, the psychic notepaper, some kind of ruler, Queen Victoria. I think it's the things like Queen Victoria that just throw it out a bit. Spaceship, Antarctic base, I would have thought. Mind control. You know, they're okay. It's just when I've used them, I've found them, they sort of throw me off a bit. and they can be a bit too specific. Oh, we've got to use the Sontarans again, and the Cybermen. It's a, you could interpret that as creatures that are militaristic, or Cybermen. We've obviously got Daleks here somewhere, and the Master is here as well. A nice picture of Roger Delgado. That's right. And you've got the Ice Warriors and the Adipose for some reason. Weeping Angels. Zygons. So yeah, I've just not found these quite as useful as the more general story cubes, but I have found the story cubes useful. I've also found the fate dice quite useful in terms of do we get a positive or a negative outcome. And in my last video, the Doctor Who one, I rolled. The Doctor's very clever. He rolls 3 dice. How many pluses does he get? He gets 2 pluses. And somebody not as clever, who is trying to persuade, might only get 2 dice to see how many pluses they get. They don't get any pluses, so the Doctor convinces them of whatever he's trying to convince them with. Now, these aren't always ideal, but I mean, sometimes you can get an evens result which doesn't tell you anything. But I found them quite useful in some of my adventures. Another thing you can do is to draw up a fate die like this. It's a very simple fate chart, really. You've got no, and, you've got no but, you've got yes and, yes but, and yes. So, is this door locked? No, and it's probably incredibly hard to open ever. So, it's just a dead simple fate chart on a die. So that's that can be quite useful. The mechanic I used in my last Doctor Who video is from Grail Quest. Now in combat, roll a 6 or higher on 2 dice. So that's basically the odds I used for any kind of success in the last game. I just rolled 2d6 to try and score a 6 or higher, and that was just taken directly from the Grail Quest game books. And also with dice you can bring in Mythic Game Master Emulator, despite some of its artwork being very dodgy indeed. But what you do get that's good is the fate chart, of course. So you decide, I think that outcome is very unlikely. So you can decide, if everything's going absolutely crazy, you can move things up here on the chaos rank, or if everything's a bit more sensible, you can move things to the left. But let's say it's in the middle. Very unlikely is 25%. I roll my percentile dice and I get 58. So yes, it was unlikely, and I completely failed. So it's not bad, Mythic, not bad at all. You can take as much of it or as little of it as you want. It's just some of the artwork is a bit strange. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Somebody's got a bit of a fixation. Yeah, they really do. I mean, basically, it's the Barbara Windsor yearbook. But you know, the fate chart's quite neat, so let's leave it at that. Now, another really useful tool can be random charts. So I drew these up for a sort of gothic horror game, and if we want a location, we roll a D66. So the first roll is the tens, that's a 6, units, 2, 62, boarding house. Now, incident, we have a choice here. 1 to 6, that's a 4, that's a ghost sighting at a boarding house. Now what enemies might we find on this in this location? If we come across a room, what's in it? 6, roll on chart 2. That's a 2, so we find 1 to 3 brutes. So let's roll that and divide it by 2, that's a 1. So we find a brute. So whatever they are, we take them on. Now, there are these encounter charts, fate charts, puzzle or trap charts, and boss charts. So we can roll 6. We find a boss clue. That's our encounter. On the fate chart, no, and whatever question we wanted to ask. So we have the fate die converted into a chart, which is, nice and simple. Puzzle stroke trap. What attribute is tested by this puzzle or trap? It is a skill challenge. So we need to overcome our skill in order to overcome the trap or puzzle. Now, what boss do we get? We roll a 6. It's a wraith. So these charts you can use to answer questions or generate things that you need to do. And that, you can have a little chart to decide how difficult a trap's going to be. So, and you have your classic hit location chart. Now, another decent set of random tables I found was this, which I've mentioned before: 100 creepy things and events to find in a spooky house. So roll a D100 and you find something spooky. So we roll a 6, which is useful because we're right there. A brazier, a small brass brazier mounted on a tripod, is found in the room. The brazier contains charcoal that is still warm, with patches glowing red maybe. Despite the fact that the house is deserted and has been for longer than the brazier has been alight, some plant material has been burnt on the charcoal and the scent of it is still present. The smell doesn't resemble that of any known herbs, but has a putrid, sticky tinge to it that nauseates any player smelling it. So you can find all sorts of wonderful and crazy things on these random tables. So they're really useful for adding colour especially. This is another oracle from Geek Gamers, which is a channel I watch quite a lot. She is absolutely brilliant at doing solo role-playing stuff. And this was one of the charts that she used. It's a D20 chart to decide outcomes. So if the outcome is, let's say, likely, it's likely that might happen. So we roll a D20 and we roll a 7. Yes, but there's a problem. Something else we need to consider. So that's a really useful chart as well. Now, you can have your classic standard random monster tables, which are really useful. So we roll a 6 and we find a vampire bat. 1 to 3, we find 1. That's another Geek Gamers Oracle. That's the same one, I think. So all of these kind of random charts are so useful for generating stuff in lieu of a GM because you're working on your own. When I did my Swords and Sorcery dungeon crawl, I used charts like these So when you're exploring, you can find what sort of passages coming up, what sort of monsters might be there, what sort of traps, what sort of loot you find, how many doors you might come across. So that's always really useful if you're doing a kick in the door dungeon crawl like I was with that. And there's your dungeon exploration. So if we roll a D100, what do we find? 18. A passage with one door. Well, that's handy. And what is in this passage with one door? Apart from a door. 100. Loot. We find loot. That's brilliant. And that's a D20. Can't resist finding out. Number 1. 1d8 times 10 gold pieces. Well, that's fun, isn't it? 3. 30 gold pieces. That will do nicely. So that's especially useful for a dungeon crawl, just to map out a random dungeon. Now, a really useful chart I found in Advanced RuneQuest, the Games Workshop edition, was a list of 20 plots. So you can make it into a D20 table if you want. So you roll a D20, 5, the challenge, okay? So the players have been challenged to do something. And there's loads of plots to choose from, which is quite handy. And I made the Quest Time of Heroes cards, the location cards, into these charts here, so I don't have to use the cards if I don't want. But those plots are really useful. So, random tables. The great thing is you can draw them up yourself. They don't cost anything, and all they really take in terms of resources is time. Because it's good to draw up enough things that you don't know what's going to come up so much. It really will be a surprise to you, and that's what you really want from this kind of mechanic. When you're using it in your solo role-playing games, you want to be surprised. And so random tables are definitely a really useful tool, because you can make them as simple or as complicated as you want. Now, cards and dice and charts are really useful at generating story prompts and plots and that kind of thing, and sudden events that are going to take you by surprise. But something else you're going to need most of the time is a rule system to tie the whole thing together. And the first solo role-playing video I did was using Dragon Roll in my Tabletop Obscurities series, because I wanted to demonstrate what Dragon Roll was all about and show a bit of an example of gameplay. So I drew up a simple little adventure, and I love Dragon Roll. It's not, I wouldn't recommend it. It's not an ideal system for solo roleplay, because there is so much limitation in the background. I mean, there are 12 creatures and 8 spells, each with a counter spell, so you've not got a lot to work with. If you're going to use this, you're going to have to make a lot of it up yourself, because unfortunately, this was pretty much all there was that was ever published, and it's a very basic system, but I love it because of nostalgia reasons. And where else can you fight a war hedgehog? I mean, fantastic game. That was my first video experience of doing a solo role-playing game. And what I started this series using was Fighting Fantasy and bits of Advanced Fighting Fantasy. Again, really simple system. It's so simple, it's not going to get in the way of the story. You can use most of your brain to think about the story, while the rules are so simple they basically look after themselves. So they were really, really useful to me. I found the players maybe got a little bit too powerful, but I probably didn't manage that very well. I could have perhaps kept them under control maybe, but the Fighting Fantasy system has got such a lot of nostalgia for me. You know, I've been playing them since the mid-80s, so a lot of fondness for this. And the Out of the Pit book has so many monsters in it. You will never run short of monsters with that. And even Dungeoneer's got plenty in it. So that was a great starting point for me. And I moved on to Swords and Wizardry. I like the system very much because it reminds me of a certain game which we won't mention, because you know it's part of the Open Game license. And you know, the Basic Fantasy and Labyrinth Lord and all these retro clones are really well done. And I took to Swords and Wizardry because I just liked it. I liked the look of it, and I liked how it provided optional rules which were from 3.5 edition and things like that, which you can use if you want. I quite like the ascending armor class thing. Plenty of monsters in here, but I did get the monster book, so I will definitely never run short of monsters with Swords and Wizardry. Wonderful game, just like the original. You are starting at a very low level with very few hit points, so you really want to level up as quickly as you can. I usually start at maximum possible hit points rather than rolling a die, because your thief and your wizards are really going to struggle with, you know, potentially 1 hit point. So if a goblin sneezes at you, you're going to keel over and die. So it's perhaps not ideal in that regard. So you need to perhaps buff up your starting characters. But yeah, I really like that game because it's based on you know what, and I love that. So that's fine. These two are also nice and simple. I tried to use Dragon Warriors, and I made a few mistakes because I wasn't used to it, so I'd like to have another go at that sometime. And Tunnels and Trolls, another nice simple system. And as I mentioned, Grail Quest is quite neat. It's a very simple system. The third book in the series comes with a bit of a bestiary which you can glean from, which I shall show you in a moment. Yeah, so the Gateway of Doom, the third in the Grail Quest series. I bought this when I was at primary school. Not this exact copy, because my original copy disintegrated because I loved it so much. But you get these Wandering Monster charts with a good few monsters on. Sorry about the glare. And you get some rules for weapons and armour. The nice thing about this book in particular, this one in the series, is that you have a nice dungeon map, and you refer to each reference when you get to it. And you have your next level, and level 3 here. And the most exciting thing is the fold-out maps. Really big levels, or a big level. And this is, again, is a nice simple system, as I mentioned before. Not quite a role-playing game, but you've got a few monsters you can choose from, a few different weapons you can have a go at, and so that's quite a neat little thing. Perhaps not as versatile as Fighting Fantasy or as elaborate, but you've got some spells you can use as well, so that's quite nice. But yeah, the point of this section is it's good to use for me. The way I play solo role-playing games is I use a simple system, and so that it doesn't get in the way of the story. I mean, if you have happy with more complicated systems, then that's fine and that's brilliant, because that suits your way of thinking. I just like to keep it simple for me. Mistfall is the most complicated game I play, and I don't want to get complicated when I do solo role playing, because I've got enough to think about. But yeah, some nice little systems there. And I will mention that in my last video I didn't use a system at all, except that I used the fate dice to give me, how many pluses do I get, or do I get more than that enemy, so I can convince them to my way of thinking. I did use the 6+ rule in Grail Quest. If I roll a 6 or more, then I'm successful in doing whatever it is I'm trying to do. So that's as bare bones and simple as you can get. So I'll either use a simple system or no system at all if I'm trying to avoid getting into fights, because I did try to do sci-fi videos before I did the Doctor Who one, and they always ended up like Star Saga. And I thought, well, why don't I just get Star Saga so I can run through shooting baddies, and that's great. So Star Saga is ideal for that. But if I'm doing a solo role-playing game, I need just that bit more fleshing out of the story, like in the Gothic horror ones, where I didn't want it to turn into a load of big fights. I wanted some investigation. And again, in the Doctor Who one, I wanted some negotiation with the baddies and trying to convince people, trying to bluff. And so what you use mechanics-wise depends on the kind of game you want. So if you think there's going to be some fights, then you're going to want to use a combat system. And if you want lots of monsters, then you're going to need something with lots of monsters in it. So, not Dragon Roar. And if you want investigation, then it might be good to leave the combat system out entirely. There you go. So those are just a few thoughts on the kind of mechanics I use. If I want a dungeon bash, then I'm going to go D&D and Swords and Wizardry. And if I want to investigate, then I might avoid rules entirely, so I don't automatically get into fights with monsters. But the tools I use are related to the kind of game I want to play. So I need my generative things, like story cubes will tell me what's going on in the story, might give me plot twists. The fate dice or a fate chart is really useful for asking questions. Is this door locked, or is there something in this room I need to discover, or that kind of thing. You need to ask questions which you would normally ask the games master, but you can't. So you need something like a fate chart or a fate dice to give you that, and you need something to generate stuff. So these card games are really useful, like Mythos and the Middle-earth card game. The location cards from Quest Time of Heroes, just something that will fire your imagination. You can divide a card game into separate decks with enemies, events, artifacts or something. You can draw one from each deck, and that can give you a story that you'll want to develop and send your adventurers off on. And yeah, that's basically it. You've got your rules, you've got your generation of the story, and your fate determining device to tell you what happens as you go along. So I hope that's been in some way helpful to try and explain what I'm doing. Over my videos I've tried to evolve what I do, as I find that some things work, some things don't, and I try new things. The one where they went into the library in the Gothic horror thing, I thought that was a bit of a letdown. I didn't think that worked very well, but again, it was an experiment. But I did like the one where it was the Red Hook story. I enjoyed that. And the House of Klaus Kramer, I enjoyed that, even though it was a sort of a dungeon crawl. But I tried my very best to make it not a dungeon crawl, so just going in and punching a monster in the face and stealing its treasure. So I enjoyed those, and the Doctor Who one was very light, but I quite enjoyed it. And even the Swords and Wizardry dungeon crawl, kick in the door, steal the Goblin's treasure thing was kind of fun. So I do enjoy working on these ideas and trying to experiment with new things, and basically using those tools I mentioned, the basic tools of either a basic system or no system, a fate generator, and something to generate the story. So anyway, that's basically it. I don't want to ramble on for too long, but I hope this has been of some use. Thanks very much for watching.